My guest today is truly a pioneer in early childhood education, teacher education, child development, and parenting of young children. Respected and known worldwide, she has authored more than 150 publications, has lectured in all 50 states, including 54 countries. She has visiting posts at universities in Australia, Canada, England, Germany, India, Israel, and the West Indies. She's a graduate of Stanford University and professor emerita at the University of Illinois. Let me introduce to you Dr. Lilian Katz. Welcome to Illinois Pioneers.
Thank you.
We're so pleased to have you here. There's so much that I would like to talk about,
All right.
including these areas that I mentioned in the introduction, child development and early childhood education. But I'd like people to get an idea of what your life has been like, what your experiences have been, and how it's brought you to be in the field that you are.
Yes.
And one point I'd like to start with, it's jumping ahead a little bit from your childhood. At the point where you were living in the United States, going to college, I know you were studying international relations. And then there was a big change when you went into education. And it seems, my impression is that for you, you suddenly felt that was really where you wanted to be. Talk about that.
It was actually the consequence of having 3 children. See, I hadn't finished my bachelor's degree when I had my first child, because in those days, I mean, what did I need it for? My intention with my wonderful husband was to have a family, and so I had 3 children. Actually, 3 children in 2.5 years. I don't recommend that, but that's what we did. And my oldest started going to, we were living in California, and we started him in a parent cooperative nursery school. There aren't many of those left because women now work a lot, but at that time, and he's 58, the mothers weren't working.
So, and just to be clear, that meant that you actually worked in the school.
I had to work there 1 day a week.
Okay.
As a participating mother. And that's how I found out how interesting and challenging it was. The teacher in charge of the whole thing impressed me tremendously. I'd never seen an adult speak to young children thoughtfully, seriously, respectfully. Most of my experience, because I grew up in England, was being scolded. And of course I grew up in the wartime, so that really affected my experience. But this woman was so interesting with the children, and then my second and third child were also in the parent co-op, and that's where I became really interested in children's development, in parenting, and I took a class, an evening class at the nearby community college on child development. I had not studied that. I'd studied foreign languages, international relations, and so on. But the professor who taught that class said to me, "Why don't you go back to school and finish your bachelor's degree?" And I said, "What for?" And she said, "You never know." Little did we know. And so I did. And then we moved with the children down south of the city of San Francisco. And I decided I needed to do some credit study of child development. I went down to Stanford University, which was close to where we lived, and they had a lab school there. And the director of that lab school wasn't very interested, and she said, "Well, you're too old to go to school." This was the old days.
Well, and didn't she also discourage you because you didn't have the background in
That's
psychology?
Right. That's right. Yeah, but this professor who helped me and encouraged me said, "I know somebody at Stanford who will help you. I'll call her," and she did. And that woman, a wonderful professor, I went to see her, and she said, "I'll put you in touch with people." Anyway, I met Professor Sears, who is, of course, no longer living, but and she and her husband both taught at the University of Illinois, like in the 1940s. And we talked for about 2 hours, and I said, "Look, I'm interested. I've learned this from my children," and so on. And this was 1964, and she knew that Head Start was coming, because it started in 65, and that there would be a great demand for people with that kind of background. She just knew that. She said, "You come in the spring quarter, I'll get you a fellowship, but you'll have to do the PhD. We don't have a master's program."
And you ended up getting your PhD at Stanford.
Right.
Well, what I'm interested in is having studied other things,
Yes.
that when you started doing the coursework and doing this kind of work, did you somehow say to yourself or have this realization that this is really maybe where I should have been all along?
No, I didn't question my past interests. I'm still interested in those things. No, but I did see that we were moving forward. And one of the attractions of the University of Illinois was that there were several people here who were well known. There was Professor Hunt, J. McVee Hunt, who is of course no longer with us, but he published a book in '61, which was the first serious attempt to say experience has a lot to do with intelligence, not just inheritance. Yeah. And it was a very famous book. And so I was attracted to this camp, but he was in psychology.
I'm going to take a couple of steps back,
Okay.
because your early experience, actually, and your husband's early experience, were both shaped by war.
Yes, very much.
The war was on when you were a girl
Yes.
in London.
I was 7 when it started.
And just on the eve of war, you were among hundreds of thousands of children who were moved out of the city into the country, because
That's right.
the fear was, and rightfully so, that the Germans were going to end up bombing the city. So people
Yes,
thought it'd be
they did.
safer to send the kids out in the countryside.
Yes. It was called evacuation. And there were, I think the statistics, I've followed some of it. I have a hard time reading it, but there were something like 627,000 children evacuated out of the city of London within that week, the week the war started, which was, I was 7 years old then. And my mother took us, I say us because I'm a twin, took us to school. They put us on buses, you know what the London buses are like, drove us out to Paddington Station, put us on trains, hundreds of children. All we had was a box about this big with a gas mask in it, and we had to practice wearing it, and a little bag with a piece of chocolate and an orange. They put us on the trains, and the train stopped at every stop en route between London and Bristol, and people came and took us and took care of us. And these were, British citizens who were doing their duty to take care of the London children. And so my sister and I were in a tiny little village in the West Country of England. On the 1st of September, war was declared on the 3rd.
And you lived like that for
2.5
2.5
years. The woman died. And by then the Blitz was over. So my mother came and took us back to London just in time for what we used to call doodlebugs, rockets that was pretty
That was
terrible.
was that the V1?
Yeah, V1 and V2.
V1 and
That's
V2.
right.
And
Yeah.
during this time, in those 2.5 years, you only saw your mom once?
Yes. She came. Well, it was wartime. You couldn't just run around and do anything you wanted. But she came at least once to see us.
So what do you think that experience meant for
Well,
you?
first of all, we lived in a not very nice neighborhood of London. My father was a ladies' tailor. It was tough. He'd work 12, 14 hours a day. And we lived in a neighborhood I wouldn't recommend. We were then out in the country, in a village, beautiful village. We could take a walk down to what the English call a copse, which is a woods with a little brook in it. And it was quite beautiful. I don't remember feeling in any way sad or miserable about it. I was with my twin, of course. Maybe that made a difference. I'm not sure. I doubt it. But we were safe, relatively. There was some bombing, but nothing compared to what it would have been in London.
So I suppose that, the natural thing to do in thinking about you, and you're going into the field of early childhood education, would be that somehow that your early experiences led you to have some kind of concerns about childhood and the experiences of kids, and that you wanted to be involved in that.
Certainly an awareness of how much goes on in the early years, that, it's not automatic. You don't just inherit things. A lot of experience. It has tremendous influence. But otherwise, I was really interested in just about everything. So that was what my mother complained, that I was the twin born with a question mark on her face. And that's true. I'm still like that.
Your father was a tailor. Your mother was a violinist, apparently a
She
very
was
good
a
one.
violinist. She was a very talented musician, but when she had 3 children, what could she do? Especially in wartime, she did continue to play, but not. But she had to drop a career.
Well, I think after the war, you and your sister both had scholarships.
Yes, at the Trinity College of Music. That was even before the war was over. We were 11 years old, and I went every Saturday for 5 years and took violin lessons and played in the orchestra.
Yeah. So, had there been some thought, or had you thought that perhaps you might have a career in music?
No, I would have thought it, except my mother said I couldn't do it. I didn't have perfect pitch the way she did, and so forth. But we all played, and my husband was a wonderful pianist. Our children are musical, so we've enjoyed it very much.
So did you and your husband and children play
Yes.
together?
Oh yes, my husband and I played together. I think he played with me because we were married, but he was good. He was really good, and he probably would have been a more serious pianist if he'd grown up in America, but he grew up in Shanghai.
Oh.
So it was a very difficult condition.
Your life has taken some interesting turns. Perhaps anyone's does, but things happened. Those points where things could have gone one way or another, and apparently you came to the United States, and your family came to the United States, in effect by chance, because your older sister had
That's
married
right.
an American soldier.
Yes.
And that's how you ended up coming
She
to the United
persuaded
States.
my parents we had to come. My father didn't want to come. He was born in England. My mother was born in Russia, but she grew up in Paris, and she never liked the English. I mean, she had a typical Parisian view of the English, you know. That's Parisian. But she had lots of relatives in the U.S., a big family in Chicago and a big family in California. And that's how we happened to go to California, so that my father said, we're going back to England. He didn't like America. And it was hard. He couldn't find work.
Was it that, or was it that you just didn't like the
Well,
ethos of
it was,
America?
It was, I don't know the details, but I know that he had trouble finding work. He was very active in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, but that didn't exist when he came. He had to do what was called piecework. He got paid for every little piece he sewed, and he struggled, really struggled. So he said, we're going back to London, where his family was. My mother said, not until we've met all the relatives. So that's why we took trains and went to Chicago and then went to Los Angeles. But once we were in California, there was no going back.
So what was Los Angeles like in the late 1940s?
Well, to us it was quite wonderful. What actually the important thing that happened there was that I went to high school to finish high school there in Los Angeles, and the April before my commencement, my graduation, our father died. He was 51, he had a heart attack, was gone in 20 minutes. So there were no options, there were no choices. It was very, very difficult. But I had a teacher at that school who came to me about 3 weeks after my father died, and she said to me, I sent 2 of your essays to someone who's interested in helping you. And I had written essays about war and childhood of war. I wish I had the essays. But she said, I sent 2 of your essays to someone who's interested in helping you. And I'll come on Sunday and drive you to meet this lady. I didn't know anything about it. So she did, and we drove about 25, 30 miles south east of Los Angeles to a little town called Whittier. I'd never heard of it, didn't know anything about it. She took me to this house, and there was this little lady about this high, and she said to me, I read the essays, and if thee is admitted to Whittier College, I will pay thy tuition. And she was a Quaker.
And Whittier is a Quaker school.
It's a Quaker school. And that's what she did. I moved in the fall for the beginning of the semester, and I tried to thank her, and she said, thee needs the help, and I can give it. That's the end of that discussion.
And you found out, I think, after she had passed, that she had in fact done this for many
maybe
other
50 girls. Yeah. She and her husband had no children of their own, and they were pretty wealthy, but they were very committed to the college. She had been the professor of Latin and Greek there, They were Pennsylvania, well, they were originally set North Carolina Quakers, but she was in the first graduating class of Bryn Mawr, which is a very old Quaker college in Pennsylvania. But she was extraordinary. She was just, and she said to me once, "What you are speaks more loudly than what you say." And that's a Quaker commitment too.
Were there other ways? You spent, I think you were at Whittier for 2 years?
Yes.
Were there other ways, do you think, that the Quaker philosophy, Quaker approach to life shaped you and stayed with you?
Oh, yes. Yes, I think of it often, and there is a Quaker community here too. I'm not an active participant. But yes, of course, taking a very critical view of any kind of war. That's very much a deep part of it. But I was very involved in what the American Friends, which is their social organization. We did a lot of work helping all kinds of people who came to the U.S. and needed help. And that was very much, and I still feel very close commitment to that community. It was very important to me.
So after spending 2 years at Whittier, you were working in San Francisco during the summer, and that's when you met Boris,
accidentally
your
met
husband.
my husband, yeah.
Well, tell me about Boris. What kind of fellow was he?
I had a classmate at Whittier who lived in the Bay Area, San Francisco. And we all worked during summer holiday in offices, file clerks and so on. She said, as long as you're going to work during summer holiday, come home and work with me in the Bay Area. So I did. And that first weekend, we went to some kind of a college dance together, she and I. And I met this fellow, and he told me his first name was Boris. And as soon as he said that, I knew he was Russian. So I gave him all the Russian I knew, because that was my mother's first language. And I told him things like, I'm hungry, I'm tired, and so all these silly little phrases. And within 3 weeks, we were engaged. And tomorrow will be 61 years since that day we met.
And you never went back to Whittier?
No. No, I stayed in San Francisco. He and his aunt had a house, and I stayed with them, and we were married very soon after that. But I went to San Francisco State to finish my bachelor's, and went after the children were in school, I went to Stanford.
And I think one other, again, there are so many of these really interesting things that happen in your life. Do I have it right that your grandparents and Boris's grandparents lived very near one another?
Yes, they came from the same part of the world.
Russia.
Russia, yeah. And they were refugees, they fled. But his family fled to China, and my mother's family and my father's fled across the continent of Europe. My mother to Paris and my father to England.
So in part, do we have him to thank, Boris, for you being here at the University of Illinois?
Yeah, I think a combination of things. But yes, he was very enthusiastic about coming here, and it was absolutely the right thing. Our children benefit. Oh, they were terribly horrified when we got here. There are no mountains, there's no ocean, there's no bay. Nothing gets in the way of the view, as my eldest son said. But they flourished here. And it was hippiedom when we left California. So
but I think also there was this idea that maybe you'd just be here for a little while and then you would go back to
originally,
California?
But we never really seriously considered going back.
Well,
and the university was very good to me.
What about the university, or maybe about the community, did you find so pleasing and it made you want to stay?
You mean here?
Yes, here.
Well, a couple of things. I enjoyed my colleagues very much, and I was the director of the ERIC Clearinghouse for 33 years. Now, ERIC is an acronym that stands for Educational Resource Information Center. It was a federal program. There were 16 clearinghouses, each one specializing in a different subject, and ours was early childhood. There was one at the National Teachers of English group, and there was one on math and one on foreign languages, but ours was early childhood right here. And I was director of that, and we were funded for 33 years until the Bush administration shut the system down. But in those early days, we didn't have computers. Every document was microfiched. I don't know if you know what a microfiche is.
Yes, I am old enough to know what a
You're old
microfiche
enough, right. Well, they're still around, but that's what we did, and we wrote abstracts, and we spent a lot of time collecting the literature. There was a lot being produced, because Head Start began in '65, and that was how the field really grew.
Well, I was really interested in hearing about ERIC because it you know, now it's billed as being the greatest, the biggest clearinghouse of information about education that there is. And now I think we're used to the idea that you can sit down at a computer and hook into enormous databases. Yeah. But at that time, there really wasn't.
No, people came here for that. Lots of people came to town because of the clearinghouse, and we provided information. We had a wonderful staff of librarians and specialists, and it was a wonderful experience. Right here on this campus was well known for that. But as I say, it was shut down, and the computer has taken over that whole thing of information dissemination. So I'm still involved. We have state funds to do state information dissemination for parents and teachers of young children.
A little bit earlier, you talked about the fact that perhaps people at the time that you were talking about going to graduate school to study education knew that at that time Head Start was going to be going and that there would be great demand for people with the background in early childhood education. So you got involved in Head Start. It was quite early. It was in the mid-60s.
I taught Head Start.
For people who are maybe not quite sure what the idea was, what was the intention of Head Start?
Well, it was actually it started as a summer 6-week program. Now it's year-round and all day in many places. But the idea was to provide stimulation. That was the term we used for poor children. Now we understand that they get plenty of stimulation. What kind is the important question. But in those days, we all thought that poor children, in fact, Hunt, who wrote about this, thought they weren't getting enough stimulation, and that's what we should do in Head Start. And also, I taught Head Start in the San Francisco area before we moved, and the children were all Spanish speaking, and that was in California, that wasn't unusual. And that was another issue of how to help them to learn some English and so on. But there were lots of problems with parents not being well informed about how to involve their children in learning a lot of interesting things around them. And so that's what Head Start was, and it's still, of course, going.
Yeah, but is it what people hoped it would be? It
varies. Like all education systems, there's some very good programs and some that need a lot of work. And but we still have very large numbers. The percentage of low-income children in this country is absolutely shocking, and it's very high. And the income level makes a tremendous difference.
You said something that reminds me of a quote of yours that I came across about the fact that when Head Start was beginning, people had this idea that particularly disadvantaged children needed a certain kind of stimulation. And you said something like, and today kids got plenty of stimulation.
They have.
The quote I'm thinking of is you said, never confuse excitement with education.
That's right. I agree.
Tell me what that means.
Well, sometimes I put it slightly differently. Don't confuse excitement with interest. When a child is interested in something, even a baby, even a 1-week-old baby, you hold a 1-week-old baby and you, let's say, sing, although my voice isn't what it could be, everything in the baby slows down. Heart rate, pulse rate, breathing rate, except information processing. That's what the origin of interest. But excitement is when all that stuff goes up, breathing rate, heart rate, and so on. That is not beneficial for children, or once in a while on a birthday or something. But what we want to do is to engage children's interest, which means becoming absorbed in something, trying to find out something, asking questions. And I do a lot of work in that area.
You I'd like to talk about, address this question of early child. What are the main issues in early childhood education in terms of three questions? I've known you've spoken about it. So in the interest of time, I'd just like to pick two.
Okay.
The questions, what should be learned and how is it best learned? So let me ask you, when we're talking about very young children, early childhood education, and whatever kind of setting they're in, what is it that you're hoping that they will learn?
Well, first of all, put that top of your list. Children always learn. Not necessarily what you want them to learn. That's amazing what the kind of swear words some young children learn. They learn. What my focus is on is for adults, parents and teachers to make a distinction between the academic aspect of learning and the intellectual. The intellect is about asking questions, hypothesizing, predicting what might happen if we do this, what if we take that, and what if we try this. That's what needs to be supported in the early years. Academic, okay, you learn the alphabet and the day. I was just thinking about this. I was visiting a preschool somewhere, and most of the kids had gone outside, and one little girl was still sitting near the blackboard where they had a big calendar, and I said to her, "You did the calendar today?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "What day is it today?" She said, "Rainy." Another child, the teacher said to this group of 4.5-year-olds, some maybe were 5, but mostly 4s, "All right, so what's a week?" And one girl said, "It's short for weekend." I mean, so this is what academic is, learning what's correct, and there's some place for it. But the intellect is encouraging children to predict, well, suppose we do that. What do you think might happen? Or what's the best way for us to do so-and-so? I do a lot of work like that all over the world, literally, about how to engage children intellectually, which is reasoning, hypothesizing, predicting, say this is how we can find out. And we underestimate children intellectually. We overestimate them academically.
Well, do you also think that we put too much emphasis on the relationship between the teacher and the child and don't think as much about what children can learn from each other?
We don't give that enough credit, but the teacher is important, because the teacher can facilitate this interchild learning. And I don't know if you read any of the work I've done with the people in Italy who've got absolutely marvelous preschools, absolutely stunning.
This is the Reggio Emilia?
Reggio Emilia, little town. Tiny little town.
Well, tell us about
That's what we
Reggio
should
Emilia.
do. But it's a long story. We don't have time for all of it. But those kids, they study what goes on around them, and they argue. But that's part of Italian culture, though, to argue, and really strongly, but still be friends. And I watched a small group of children who decided to build a table and chairs out of clay. And one kid says, and these were 4-year-olds, and so they take the clay and they're rubbing it to make the legs of the table. And one kid says, "It's not going to work if you do it like that. See, look at mine. Yours is too fat." And the other one says, "No, yours is too thin." This kind of interaction, arguing, and then seeing which will really work. And the other kid said, "Hey, you're right. That does work better." Now that sounds silly, but it's reasoning, observing, arguing, trying things. That's what the children should be doing.
And as we teach teachers and prepare them to go in the classroom to do this, do we teach them how to do that?
We certainly try to do that. But now, of course, what's ruining the whole concept is all the standardized testing. And teachers feel a lot of pressure to prepare kids for the tests.
Well, the problem is that one of the big buzzwords has become accountability. And people say
that again?
accountability.
Accountability.
People say, I'm supporting the schools with my tax dollars.
Right.
I'm sending my children.
Yes.
All I want you to do is to demonstrate to me in some concrete way what the children have achieved. And it seems the only way we can think of to do that is periodic high-stakes testing
know.
at certain times,
But
a
of course
very narrow range of skills we test. And so that's the complaint of teachers, is that we have to spend so much time making sure that they'll pass the test, because they will punish us and they will
That's
punish the
right.
school if they don't.
Well, what
meet
I've
the
often
standards.
said to teachers, not so much preschool, but certainly kindergarten, first graders, say Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for 30 minutes we're going to practice how to answer the questions on the test, but use the rest of the time well. Really well, where the kids are actually investigating things, and that's what they do so well in Italy. I've worked with a lot of teachers who've really got the kids out there investigating a local supermarket. I have wonderful pictures where this group of 4-year-olds, a couple of the kids had reached 5, and they broke up into small groups, and this group was going to count all the different kinds of potatoes in that huge supermarket. The other group decided to interview the manager, and it's so interesting. There were about 5 kids, and they were firing questions at him. Do you take all the money home? Do you put it under your bed? How much money? And then the manager talks to them like this, and they draw everything. That's the other thing. And when they're drawing, they say, see that? What's that called? Why is that there? This is all intellectual engagement using the pencil and the paper and so on and so forth. And other kids, that is a wonderful example of how children can study things in their own experience, but explore it in depth and say, well, why is that there? How come you have it like that? Why don't you do it this way? And because kids are natural question askers.
Mm-hmm. Well, that also suggests the value of getting out of the
That's
classroom,
right.
which, and I don't know how teachers or parents or anybody
Well,
feels
some
about that.
schools said they allow it better, but there are other things. Like I've worked with teachers who couldn't take the kids out, and so I've said, well, give every kid a clipboard like that with blank paper and a pencil, and say, when you go home, draw anything you see in your apartment or whatever, your house, that you can sit on. Do you know how many different things there are? Benches and stools and toilets and so on. And then go next door and ask the other people. And then they begin to talk about which things are round, which are straight, which are rectangular, which are soft, which are padded, which are wooden, which are steel. Lots to learn.
You have talked a little bit about this approach that you have seen in Italy. And I know that you have spent a lot
It
of time.
actually started in Chicago, by the way,
Oh, well,
in the turn of the century.
my kind of town. And that you've done a lot of traveling and
Oh, yeah.
and
I've
done
been there
observing and so on,
16
all
times.
over the place.
Yeah.
So, are there other places you think that we can learn from, and why is it that, that this place in Italy should be doing
That's
so much
another whole
better than
semester.
we?
The leader of that movement, actually, he learned about that. He's no longer living. I knew him pretty well. He didn't speak English, but his French was good, and that's my second language, so we got along quite well. But he had learned it from Dewey at the University of Chicago, Dewey said the trouble with the kids at the lab school at the University of Chicago is that they sit and argue about who has the nicest fountain pen. There's a whole world out there for them to understand where their bread comes from, where their milk comes from. And that's the beginning of this, what we call project approach. And they did it for quite a while, and then the schools got too big in Chicago, so they made them into factories. That's what they are now. They're factories.
Well, wasn't that the idea that they were supposed to prepare the children to be factory workers?
Well, partly that, but it was, you have to say all 4-year-olds this and all, and by the way, in Britain, I remember in the 50s and 60s, they had, for the elementary ages, they had mixed ages, so that older children were getting a lot of experience of showing younger children how to do things, and when those younger children were the older ones, they were already good at that. That's the way to do it. Our children should be in mixed age groups in the early years. Maybe not when they're 10 or 12, but certainly in the early years, because there's a great deal to learn when a 4-year-old comes to you and you're a 5-year-old and says, show me how to make this, or show me how to write that. Why not? I've written a lot about mixed age groups.
Is maybe something in this has to do with perhaps not having resources, and so what you do is you do the things. If you don't have,
Yes.
if everybody doesn't have a computer, well, then you take the kids out.
Yeah.
You take more advantage of getting outside the classroom, doing simpler things.
Yeah.
And it maybe having high-tech resources is not necessarily
No,
helpful.
not necessarily. I think you could wait a while for that.
Well, what do you think about the idea that every child should have a computer and internet access?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Pardon me, that every child should have a computer and access to the internet.
I don't see why. Give me a good reason. Maybe at home, but not in the classroom. There should be some computers that they can turn to when they're useful. But I'm worried about some of the children not learning to write. What's going to happen? But my experience is that when the children are investigating something around them in great detail, they get so interested because they're naturally nosy. And that's what you're building on. And then they say, you know what I found out? This, show me how to write it. How do I write this word? And the other one that I've seen quite often, there are lots of good reports, is children saying, show me how to measure it. And where is this school? Forget now. Where the children, oh, I know, up in Rockford, Northern Illinois, where in the community college, the preschool was right next door to the room where automobile mechanics were trained, just by accident. So the kids studied what went on in there in great detail, and they decided to build a car. And the problem was how to figure out how big the wheels had to be. And the teacher gave them a ruler, a long one, and they went into the lab next door where the cars were up on the, what do you call it?
On the lift.
On the lift. And they said, we have to measure the wheels, and they did. And these are kids who don't really ever have measurement experience, but they said, this is how long it was, so we put a mark on there, that's where it is. And they built 4 wheels using the measurement. Now look at what's going on there.
Just a couple of other areas I'd really like to get into, if it's okay. One of the difficulties teachers have, they come into a classroom, the children are all so different.
The children
are all different. You know, they learn in different ways, they have different skill sets. How can one teacher hope to give children what they need if she has 20 or 24 or 25 or 29 students?
Well, it's not easy, it's difficult. Again, that's another good reason why we should mix the ages.
So the older ones
can help younger ones, or the teacher is very busy helping an older one who needs help, or vice versa. And there's in some of the Scandinavian countries have very good schools, but they have very small population. They have a lot of mixed ages, a lot. And they capitalize on the resources there. And not all older children are good at helping younger children, but you can show them how to do it. He'll understand what you're trying to tell him if you say it this way, kind of thing. That's what the teacher can do.
You know, you've written about the fact that education is not just about knowledge and skills.
No, it's about dispositions.
So how does the teacher deal with the challenge of children who are mean, who are aggressive, those children who do not play well with others?
Yeah.
What do you do with them?
Well, by the way, the evidence is pretty clear. You've got to get that right by about the age of 6, or it's too difficult. And we do know how to do it, but it's got to be when they're young. And we're learning more and more about how to do it, and it can be done, and it really must be done to help children to solve those problems and to address each other more positively. But by the time they're 7, 8, 9, they identify themselves, they define themselves as bullies. And they wouldn't know who they are if they weren't bullying. And that's why it's very important to get that done in the preschool period, and even kindergarten, depends. But we do know how to help those children. But I can't go into it all now. But
well,
yes.
we've really come to the end of the time, and I wish we could continue. there are many other things we could talk about. One last thing. Let me ask you
Okay.
one last thing. For people who have no children, or whose children are grown up, or even people who have school-aged children, but say, my children go to a wonderful school, they're doing great. Why should any of these people care about the other people's children? What's in it? You know, why should they be interested in all the children?
I mean, for lots of reasons. One is because the kids who don't do well could cause them some problems later on. But the other is because part of being an American is to care about your community. And these are all members of your community. Why not? And it is important. And there's what else?
Yeah.
Would you care about other than building as solid and as satisfying a community as you can?
Well, we'll have to leave it at that. Dr.
Okay.
Lilian Katz, thank you very much
Well,
for talking with us.
well, I hope
Don't get up and walk away quite yet. Thanks very much for being with us. We appreciate it. I want to say also thanks to everyone for watching. I'm David Inge. Join us next time for the next Illinois Pioneers.